Very, very interesting. And I think it's important because there's going to be other sports open. We mentioned the soccer. We mentioned, you already got ping pong. I wonder if those dudes are tested over there.
I don't know. It's Russia. You never know.
Yeah, you never know. But a man who knows this because he's an attorney, he's a sports lawyer. He knows this stuff. He's got beautiful teeth and beautiful hair, which is important as well when you want to be on all these media places and you know what you're talking about. He's got the combo. He's got the whole package.
You got to look sharp.
He does look sharp. He's a sharp-dressed man. He's Dan Lust, Esquire, and again, no relation to Kendra Lust, even though he's been asked this numerous times on this program. Dan, how are you, man?
I'm good, and suspect number one, and wondering if I'm related to Kendra is alongside you, Tony.
I know he is. I know Harry addressed it with you.
Yep.
I know Eitan addressed it with you, and I have. So I just want people to know, all the new audience out there that hasn't heard you before in this program, that's the first thing they're going to think of, right?
I'm pleading the fifth here. Okay, I'm pleading the fifth.
All right, Dan, so now we have, back in the day on the People's Court when Judge Wapner was there, we had Doug Llewellyn, and he always had to have papers that he had waiting for you in the back room. So now when it comes to sports, there's going to be papers waiting for you before you even enter the room, correct?
That's where we're trending to. And, Tony, it's funny. You're kind of half joking if they're testing ping pong players. We had some news in the past 24 hours that kind of went under the radar. Across the world, obviously all sports are dealing with this. We have our own domestic issues. But, under the radar, the first sports-related death from COVID-19 in the sumo wrestling world of all places. So this is not an issue that's, it's not an issue that's really restricted to our country. The entire world is dealing with this. So, when we talk about the UFC, and I mentioned, it's a serious issue as much as, there is some hope that, that Florida's opening up and we're seeing sports pop around. The fact that UFC was able to go off without a hitch on Saturday, that's pretty, good progress. When it comes to something like COVID-19, Tony, in order for sports to move forward, the athletes in the sports world have to accept some level of risk. And I bring up this sumo wrestling thing. There's no real way to know for sure if you have a fully safe venue. So that's why these waivers are critical. That athletes have to understand that even though the risk is very small, right? It's a very small percentage. I'm not a scientist or a doctor, but the risk of death is generally pretty small from COVID-19. It's still out there. So that's why these waivers for UFC, as reports are, a full liability assumption of the risk waiver in order for fighters to fight and get paid. And that might be, Tony, as draconian as it sounds, that might be the future of sports in the immediate landscape.
So this is not only a waiver for the participants, the combatants, if you will. It's also for any fans that would want to be in the building to witness it live, right?
Well, we haven't seen that yet, right? Fans haven't been allowed in the venue, but you can imagine if they're making their fighters do it, and
right.
Imagine their athletes. That's probably the next logical step. And Harry, unbeknownst to a lot of people, when you go to a game, if you look at the back of your ticket, there's liability waiver language on there, right?
Yeah.
You assume the risk of getting hit with a foul ball, a flying bat, or a puck, right? I remember years ago there was a death at a Columbus Blue Jackets game from a girl on her birthday got hit in the head with a puck. That's always there, but just like UFC had to rewrite their language, you're going to see the back of this ticket language, maybe even a little bigger, right? People are actually going to read it, and you're going to probably have to take into account these airborne diseases that, since the Spanish flu, we've nearly never had to consider for sports.
Now, the other interesting thing, Dan, is that this waiver also forbade any of the fighters from criticizing anything involving what they believe or not believe was done properly, right? They would actually be penalized if they disagreed with what the UFC was doing in any way, shape, or form, correct?
So this had something called a non-disparagement clause. It's pretty
like
standard.
A non-disclosure agreement.
Yeah. It's kind of non-disparagement. You can't speak badly about the company. You can, non-disclosure. You can't talk about certain things about it. But anti-disparagement, non-disparagement, can't speak badly when it came to the UFC about their health and safety protocol. So there were some reports that media members also had to sign this. I don't have any confirmation of that, but that extended really to seemingly anyone that was around the UFC, and they said the extent that you violated this clause. That you lost your payday for the fight, your purse, and any type of fight of the night bonuses or anything that would have come with it. So again, there's been some people that have pointed out the combination of signing a liability waiver, plus signing an anti-disparagement clause that you can't talk about if you feel unsafe. But that's, that combination is a little heavy, and it's surprising that, the fighters agreed to it. But at the end of the day, right, these guys need to make a living. They need to fight. They have a national spotlight. I'm sure their ratings were, best they've seen in a while because they had the whole sports world. But, between those two levels, I know Dana White was making the rounds that sports commissioners around the country were reaching out to him to see how he got it done. And that's probably what he told them. Number one, liability waivers. Number two, anti-disparagement clauses. Because, for as much as we want these sports to go forward, we saw 2 months ago, one positive test, Rudy Gobert, took down the entire sports world. So you can't really, if you're the sports commissioners, you can't have these athletes going around and, talking about how unsafe they feel because, that's just might bring down the whole infrastructure. So, again, as draconian as it sounds, that's what allowed the UFC to proceed. So we kind of have to pick our battles with this one if we want sports to return.
Talking with Dan Lust, Esquire. I love saying Esquire, though, because, you don't get money. There's an Esquire magazine is dead, but Esquire just sounds right. It's like being an ambassador who goes out and snitches on people who are not social distancing. You feel that way?
Yeah.
You feel, does Esquire add a little extra something other than another word on your business card, Dan?
Well, the thing is, when you have a last name of Lust, you need to counterbalance it a little bit with some seriousness. So you get the Lust, and then you get the Esquire. So it finds a happy medium.
I used to lust after Esquire magazine because they had a lot of girly pictures back
did.
in the day when they were competing with Playboy and all those magazines. Not as risque, though. All right, Dan, now, when you look at the UFC, the fact that they were the first league and a very brutal sport to go out and do it, does that put pressure on other leagues to say, you can't social distance in boxing and that sport in particular. You can in golf. You can in soccer. You can't. But
no.
But the sports like baseball, you can in baseball. You can social distance. Because even if the catcher's there and the batter's there, the catcher has a mask on to begin with. So we're seeing what's going on in Korea. Does this help in any way, shape, or form? I'm not saying force American sports to do what they're doing around the world, but at least give them a little more comfort that this can be done safely in some sports, especially the ones where there's no contact.
Yes and no. So I agree with you. I mean, I've been watching the Korean League. Taiwan's been going on, having their baseball league. You could have a baseball game where, what are the only times you're having social distancing problems, right? The batter, maybe you're holding a guy on base, there's some type of tag play. Baseball can do it. It's probably going to be tougher for soccer, basketball, football. But when you're asking what type of pressure it puts on these leagues, I mean, it's kind of a different story because, Tony, the elephant in the room when it comes to the UFC is that there's no union, right? So Dana White kind of calls the shots. It's not really a bargaining situation. If they want the show to go on, the UFC is going to have it go on. That's the problem when it comes to, Major League Baseball, basketball, football, hockey. These unions, and as we're seeing pop up over the last couple of days, these unions are not going to let these things slide by. If the players don't feel healthy, the sport can't go on. I mean, we saw, Khabib drop out because, right, he was caught in Russia with this travel issue. The show went on. They replaced him. The problem is you can't really replace like a Mike Trout who has his own, hesitation about playing because his wife is due to give birth in a couple months, and he doesn't want to be caught, in a bubble-type scenario, unable to leave and might miss the birth of his daughter. So that brings up, Tony, Harry, a larger issue in sports, which I don't really know how they're going to grapple with it. When it comes particularly to basketball, right, we saw Adam Silver yesterday say that he's going to make a decision on cancellation, try to have a decision in the next 2 to 4 weeks. We've heard him say that owners want 30 days to ramp up before the games get started, right? And they still have to fit in. They're at 63 to 66 games now. They got to fit in about another 15 to 20 games. And then Silver said he wants a full playoffs. So I'm just doing the math here. Lawyers aren't really good at math, but I'm just a layperson doing this. That's a lot of stuff to fit in really a 3-month period between June, and then some of the owners are saying that they don't want to play past September because that'll go into the next season. So really a 3-month period to fit all this in. Tony, again, I'm just doing the math. That doesn't leave a lot of room for a 14-day quarantine period if a player gets it. So I think, again, to your original question, does the UFC put pressure on these sports to get it done? Sure. But we haven't seen this really work domestically with the team sport. Does the player drop out by himself? Does the team, do the Lakers forfeit a playoff game if one of their players gets it? That's the logistical stuff that just really hasn't been worked out, and I don't really think there's an easy solution to it. So, again, it's kind of apples to oranges when it comes to the UFC and these pro-unionized sports.
Do you know if they've done this with the Bundesliga, which is scheduled to start this weekend over in Germany?
If they've done in terms of waivers?
Yeah, like waivers, releases, or whatever.
I don't think it's been reported, but it wouldn't surprise me. In terms of testing, they're doing kind of the same stuff that MLS is doing. Temperature checks when you walk on site.
Mm-hmm.
They're not. I guess another interesting point just for the NBA's purposes, in order to have any really safe scenario, you're going to have a massive amount of tests.
Right.
The NBA asked for 15,000 tests. That's what they kind of projected they needed done. Silver, he says even though manufacturers can provide 15,000 tests, he doesn't want to, and this is again a credit to Silver. He doesn't want to take 15,000 tests out of the public sphere if the public doesn't have mass access to tests. So, I'm sure the Bundesliga has their own kind of strategy. Waivers have not really been used outside of the UFC context domestically. But again, it's uncharted territory. Could fans see waivers? Sure. Could it extend to the the team unionized sports? I'd be surprised if that wasn't on the table now. And these offers that someone like a Trevor Bauer is on record today saying, the Major League Baseball's offer was a joke to come back. So I imagine these type of waivers are on the table now. I'd be surprised if they weren't.
Dan Lust with us. Now, you mentioned these leagues, baseball, obviously basketball, and hockey, the ones that are right now, the clock is ticking on their leagues. But you have a situation where I think we've all could agree that June 10th, if something isn't decided, because that's when the baseball players supposedly want to do their 2 weeks of spring training part 2 before they could start a season in July and have at least an 82-game schedule, which would make it at least legitimately representative of enough games to decide a championship. But when you got, June 10th, is that not the drop-dead date you can see for all of these leagues? Not the NFL, because they would still have more time, but baseball, basketball, and hockey in particular, that to me seems like that's where the clock is ticking down to.
I don't think there's any real drop-dead date. It's getting close. Tony, I know I've been very vocal about it, on Twitter. When it at least comes to the NBA, there was this force majeure clause. Baseball has a version of it. It's called the national emergency clause. You see it kind of across sports. But I guess basketball is the one that I'm kind of worried about because they're halfway through a season. They're creeping up on next season. That's the one I'm kind of concerned about. Just not to get too technical, the NBA owners had a 60-day window to cancel the season per force majeure, per the NBA's force majeure clause. That actually expired, Tony, Harry, on Sunday, on Mother's Day. So I'm watching it. I got it circled on my calendar. I wake up Monday morning, no news, no Woj bombs, no nothing like that. So I'm ready to tweet out, no news is good news. It looks like the owners have allowed this window to cancel to expire. And then Woj drops a Woj bomb and says, actually, they didn't let it expire. They actually extended that window to cancel for another 60 days. So if you're just kind of doing the math here, that would allow the NBA to cancel the season up until July 10th. They moved it back 60 days. So if you were trying to hope that basketball was going to come back, you would say, hey, they let that deadline expire. It must mean good news, right? It must mean that good news is on the way. But a 60-day extension to cancel, that tells us that, they need some more time to figure this out. So I'd be surprised if we knew by June 10th what was going to happen in really any of the 4 major sports.
How airtight are these waivers? Like, let's just say we roll it forward to football season and fans, the Miami Dolphins came up with a plan where their stadium capacity goes from 65,000 to 15,000, and those 15,000 have to sign a waiver, but some guy contracts the virus, and he goes back to the Dolphins and saying, I got it at your stadium, regardless of this waiver, I'm suing you.
So, there's 2 points that come up. So number one, you can have any type of clause in the contract. Just because you sign it doesn't mean you're stuck to it. Some of these clauses can and sometimes are deemed to be unconscionable or something that's called against public policy. So I know in the legal Twitter, people were saying when it came to the UFC's contract, the fact that they had this non-disparagement clause and a full COVID-19 assumption of the risk, and guys I pieced through it. It even talked about not coming into contact with people that could have pre-existing issues in your personal life, right? Aunts, uncles, those people couldn't speak negatively about, the health and safety protocol. So, again, you can make the argument that that's something that seems a little restrictive. So, Harry, when you ask, are these airtight? They're airtight to the extent that someone wants to challenge it and tell a court, hey, this is unconscionable, this is against public policy. But, the larger legal point, right? So no one can ever prevent someone getting sued. There's no such thing as like a shield to prevent a lawsuit. You can get sued, and then you could throw it out of court. When it comes to lawsuits that could come from COVID-19 infection, we have in our country, people think that it's completely uncharted territory. It is, but we do have, case law about the transmission of a disease. And it's not as common, right? We haven't seen COVID-19 lawsuits that much. I mean, we have seen one. I know I was, one of the first people to talk about it. A Walmart employee actually sued Walmart for having to work and passed away from, getting infected with COVID at work. So the question for this lawsuit and any other lawsuit that comes from a fan or an athlete, you'll have to show that the carelessness of the venue, the team, the league, that carelessness directly caused you to contract COVID-19. Mm-hmm. The problem with that, guys, on a practical level, is you have to rule out all other potential causes, right? No, it wasn't the time you went to CVS. It wasn't the time you went to Whole Foods. You have to rule all of those out. Yeah. So it's almost impossible to narrow down COVID being caused by you going to that arena at one time. But, just from a legal perspective, the teams, the leagues, their obligation is to provide a reasonably safe venue. What that means, that's why the Bundesliga is doing something a little bit different. UFC is doing something a little bit different. I'm sure that the pro sports, the unionized sports will do something different. It just has to be reasonably safe. There's no scenario where you can guarantee 100% safety because, guys, that's why we see foul ball lawsuits, hockey puck lawsuits. We know going to a game there's at least some chance of getting hurt, but it's the teams, the leagues, their obligation to provide a reasonably safe means. And, the UFC does kind of show the template for what can be reasonably safe and have an event go out with any hitches.
And on that point where the tickets on the back tell you that they're not responsible to get, we saw what happened when people do get hit by baseballs or hockey pucks and it results in death. They immediately go into action. There's going to be a lawsuit. They put up extra netting. We've seen it in all sports. So they want to make sure that they can prevent it from happening again. But despite the fact that it has happened, those people who have died do have legal rights, even though it says on the ticket, right?
Assumption of risk or whatever.
The assumption of risk.
You do to some extent. I mean, there's assumption of the risk, there's implied assumption of the risk, and there's explicit assumption of the risk. So sometimes you go to a hockey game, it doesn't have to say it on the back of the ticket. You know you can get hit with a puck. It's just, kind of common sense. Other times, like let's say in a context where you go skiing or you rent a snowmobile, you sign a waiver that says, I understand all the risks and, I sign away and I won't sue. Again, you could still get hit with a lawsuit. Then it kind of comes down to what you knew, if you still acted reasonably under the circumstances, whether this was implied, assumption of risk or explicit. But at the end of the day, that's why, we're seeing kind of teams go on the preemptive attack. Tony and you guys mentioned, I was listening to you guys, kind of pulling out seats from the arena. I know I've been talking about there's something called Lux seating, L-U-X-E, really trying to create a baseball stadium where we kind of have rows of four and you remove 6 feet of seating all around it. I mean, that's just one way to kind of create a safer means. So if you do have a lawsuit at some point in time, the court's going to say, well, what did the team do? What did the league do to prevent this? Did they act reasonably under the circumstances? Just because you have a harm all the way down the line, right? Someone gets hit in the head with a hockey puck. You still need to show that on the other end there was some careless, there was some negligence on the part of the teams or the leagues, and that's the uphill battle, right? The UFC just went off without a hitch. They showed us what needs to be done to have a reasonably safe venue. So that's why, and I believe Dana White, that commissioners across sports were calling him because, whether we want it or not, UFC has just kind of set the barometer in our country to see what a safe event can look like. So that's why all eyes, again, should be on the UFC for each of these events, for lawyers or fans just trying to see what the landscape's going to look like.
Yeah, one of our listeners, T-Bo's Pretzel, says it's like the mechanical bull. When you go into one of these bars, you sign a waiver. You're getting up there. If you fall and break your neck, there's cushioning and everything else, but that's a risk that you take.
Right. You can. I mean, the mechanical bull guy, is it Tebow or T-Bone?
It's Tim Tebow's Pretzel. Yeah, I don't know what that means, but that's his name.
Well, so Tim Tebow, he can sue the bar for going on the bull, but at the end of the day, he signed it away, and then he also has to show that the bar did something careless that caused his injury. And if the guy got on the bull and assumed the risk of getting on the bull and he got hurt, I mean, that's going to be the defense of the bar. That's going to be the defense of UFC and any of these sports leagues.
All right, now in college football, as we look ahead to the fall, you've got some schools in the SEC in particular adamant that they're going to play football, and then you've got other coaches saying, no, if our kids can't go to school,
like
Herm Edwards at Arizona State, if we can't have students there, then we can't have football. How is that going to play out? Is there a world where there's only going to be some conferences saying we're going to play and the other conferences aren't?
It's crazy.
crazy. It's the wild, wild west. You said it right, Harry. It is crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing, too, guys, we just saw in California, and I know, Tony, you and I were talking about this offline. California is shutting down the schools, really. It's the California state schools, Fresno State, for the fall semester. Mm-hmm. So there can be no football played at those schools. So then you have to ask yourself, right, okay, let's say football goes forward. Do these schools just have no home games? Are they going to be like, the New Orleans Hornets back in the day going to play games in Oklahoma? That's the scenario that's on the table. I can't imagine a world where certain schools are playing and other schools are not. I imagine the NCAA is going to have some uniform action in that sense. I know Mark Emmert came out yesterday that he can't set the dates ahead of time, a uniform date across the table, just because everything's still in flux. But I imagine that's the move at some point. And again, just kind of coming back a couple months, the NCAA extended across the board the eligibility of all spring athletes. That's something they've obviously never done before. They've never had to. But in obviously a similar situation, they took all of their spring athletes across all sports, men and women, and they extended their eligibility for another year. I imagine if football gets canceled or some schools start to say we can't have students on campus, that they'll extend eligibility for another year for these fall athletes. It's just logical under the circumstances. I can't see a world where certain conferences are playing and other ones aren't, and other ones are playing, but they're playing in a different state, in a different school. That just seems like a gigantic hardship for these players who, guys, mind you, are not getting paid to do this yet. So it's a different context from the pros where, maybe you take on some risk, but you're getting paid millions to do it. That's not the equation in college.
Dan Lust, normally this kind of a session would cost upwards of $500-600 just to get this kind of legal advice. And then I get another bill a week later. Mm-hmm. But that's why we love Dan Lust, because he's good at what he does, he knows his stuff, and he doesn't charge us. And I don't even have to have him on a retainer, which is awesome.
No retainer, no nothing, absolutely free for you guys.
Now, Dan, we have a couple questions, one of which is sort of a follow-up question from one of the guests that we had on earlier this week, who normally is very clean-shaven, great-looking young man, very well-dressed, but he has gone completely terrorist-looking beard. Now, we have your photograph up here. Again, good-looking, clean-cut, great dress. Are you going with the complete disheveled look during the coronavirus?
I thought you were going to ask me if I was going with the terrorist look. Robin, no, I'm not. I'm not on video right now, but I'm keeping it pretty tight. I have virtual conferences with these judges every day. I got to keep it fresh. I got to shave. I can't go full caveman yet.
Because we have your shot, your professional shot up, and you can follow Dan Lust at Sports Law Lust. That's kind of sexy.
Yeah.
Sports Law Lust, ladies and gentlemen. Follow him on Twitter. And you can get all of his information. But he's, there's no way a man that looks that good with the great teeth, the great hair, and a clean-shaven look and a nice tight tie can ever go disheveled, Harry. You just can't do that.
I agree.
Dan, thank you once again for coming on. Really appreciate it, buddy.
Always my absolute pleasure, guys, and congrats on the new show. I've been loving it. Some huge guests, and I'm happy to be a part of the action.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Court's in session.
He's the official attorney of the show, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
He's like our Johnny Cochran.
Right.
Sports attorney.
Sports
attorney.
Yeah, well, this is a sports show.
Yeah.
He's not going to handle my divorce.
There was actually another attorney after hearing